Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue on with the problem of universals. So I wanted to look at three of the traditional arguments in favor of realism about abstract universals. So a universal is, in this sense, is a shareable quality or relation, such as felininity or betweenness or something of that sort. The first being a property, the second being an example of a relation. Realists about abstract universals believe that these shareable properties or relations exist and exist apart from the mind. There are two forms of realism, moderate and extreme. Moderate realists follow in the footsteps of Aristotle, who said that these abstract universals depend for their existence on their being exemplified or possessed by some individual thing, concrete individual thing or a particular that exemplifies the universal. That's the moderate realism. So it says that these properties and relations exist apart from the mind, but depend for their existence on things. So there wouldn't be catness unless there were cats, according to the moderate realist. In contrast to moderate or Aristotelian realism, there's extreme or Platonic realism, which in the modern sense of that terminology says that abstract universals exist independently of whether or not they happen to be exemplified or possessed or realized by particulars or concrete individual substances. So they would say that catness exists whether or not cats exist. If cats became extinct, there would still be catness. There might be other properties that are never exemplified even, like a property that all unicorns would have if there were unicorns, the property of unicornicity, or dragonhood. So Platonic realists believe in unhad properties, whereas moderate realists, following Aristotle, only believe in properties that are had by something that exists. So the Platonic realism is more extreme. Both of them are opposed, though, to conceptualism, which says that universals really are things in the mind, and therefore are not real beings all on their own. They're mental constructions. Conceptualism being a form of nominalism, a belief that only particulars exist. Any question on that? There are various forms of nominalism, as we've seen. The crudest form was held by Rosalind, who held that universals are just the sounds or puffs of air that emanate from our mouths when we say something like cat. So Rosalind held that the word cat is a universal in the sense that it can be predicated of many things. And by a word, he just meant the puffs of air that come out of your mouth when you vocalize the word cat. So it's just those air vibrations, which are corporeal things. So for Rosalind, universals exist apart from the mind, but he's still not a realist because they turn out to just be corporeal things rather than qualities or relations. So Rosalind denies the existence of qualities and relations and only believes in the existence of individual things or corporeal objects or bodies, to put it in the simplest way. All right, so I'm going to give you a little handout here. I'll post this in the in Canvas under Files, along with other class notes that I've posted in the past. This will save me having to cover myself with chalk, as I usually do. So this has three of the traditional arguments for realism about universals. The first is known as the formal cause argument. So the formal cause argument says that the best, in essence, says that things fall into kinds. For example, Morris is a cat, Garfield is a cat, Felix is a cat, and so on. So we can naturally say that Morris, Felix, and Garfield and other relatives of theirs fall into the cat kind. And then the argument advances to say that there must be a cause or explanation of the fact that these things fall into that common kind or group. And it then is further argued that that's something which explains why they all fall into the common group can only be a shared quality, shared by those individuals, such that if those individuals share that quality, it logically follows that they belong to that group, the common group. So, premise one of this particular illustration of the formal cause argument, because you could illustrate it with a vast number of different examples, right? Dogs, tables, whatever kind you want to pick, right? There are all these kinds. And for the Platonic, for the realist, whether Platonic or Aristotelian, for any group of existing things that fall into a kind, there'll be a group property which accounts for the fact that those things fall into that kind, and it'll be a shared quality, making it an abstract universal. And a similar argument could be run for relations as well, a parallel argument. But the property case is simplest. So premise one here says that Morris is a cat, Garfield is a cat, Felix is a cat, etc. So you can imagine then that you have these three cats. Morris, Felix, and Garfield over here, who's the biggest eater of the bunch. So these three concrete things or particulars certainly indisputably exist, unless you're some kind of extreme skeptic or something who doesn't even believe in the existence of cats, right? We've seen that there are such individuals, philosophies that deny that we can know or even reasonably hypothesize anything, but staying away from those extreme views, and certainly nominalists do that. They believe that particulars exist and only particulars. So these three cats would exist. Then the argument's saying there must be something about these individuals, Morris, Felix, Garfield, and any other cats that you care to put up there. Must be something about them which accounts for all of them being cats. So this is appealing to an idea of metaphysical explanation, saying that there must be something which explains why these things fall into a common group. I mean, it wouldn't be true of any things that you picked that they would fall into that group. Suppose we pick that water bottle this book and my left sneaker, right? Those three things wouldn't fall in the same group with Morris, Felix, and Garfield, right? So there should be some reason to explain, like what's the difference, right? Why do those three things fall into the common group cat, whereas the water bottle, the book, and the left sneaker don't fall into that same group? Does that make sense? I mean, in defense of two, I guess one could appeal to a principle of sufficient reason, say, that says everything must have a cause or explanation. The principle might be put by saying, for any positive fact, there is an explanation of that fact. I don't know if we need to go that far. I mean, some have argued that there might be some facts that don't have an explanation, like the existence of the universe or something like that, right? Maybe it doesn't have any explanation because there's nothing outside of it which could explain it or something. But nonetheless, in general, as a matter of scientific and also philosophical method, we do seek to explain phenomena that we encounter. For example, if someone wakes up in the morning and they have all kinds of red bumps all over their body, and they don't feel very well, we would seek for an explanation of why that is. Right? The explanation might vary. Thousands of years ago, the explanation might have been the person has been possessed by an evil spirit that is, and we need to call an exorcist or medicine man to expel the spirit from them so they can become well again. Now we have a different view, right? Which is that there are invisible, inconceivably tiny little entities that have infested the person that are making them have these red spots, called bacteria or viruses or whatever, depending on what the case might be, right? That are causing the person. And we need to call the doctor to give the person some medication that will free them, kill these invaders, and make them well again, right? But we wouldn't say, no, it's just some like totally random thing. It just happens sometime. There's no rhyme or reason or explanation as to why people wake up this way with red spots all over them and they're very ill, right? We try to diagnose an illness like measles or something and then say that there's a specific cause of that, right? An explanation for why it happens. So in general, then, we seek for explanations. So I would argue that the following maxim is defensible, at least, that all other things being equal, one should try to explain as much as one can. You might eventually encounter something that you can't explain, like the existence of the universe or something. A fact that has no explanation or which cannot be explained is usually referred to as a brute fact. So that's the term used for facts that have no explanation. They're brute or brutal. They just sort of confront you and there's nothing you can really do with them. So maybe the existence of the universe, or maybe there are basic laws of nature that are so elemental or fundamental that nothing further can explain them. Right? There might be some basic law. Like no one's ever explained the law of gravity so far. They're still searching. They haven't given up. They're trying to find little particles called gravitons, which would explain why gravity occurs. But so far they haven't found them. But it takes a long time to find these particles, right? Like the Higgs boson, right? They searched for that for a very long time. till they finally did find it. That particle explains why objects have mass, supposedly. So they say there may be a particle that explains why particles that have mass attract each other. They haven't yet found it, but it could be out there. Or gravity could be a fundamental, inexplicable thing. But the point is we don't jump right away to the conclusion that something's unexplainable until we've tried our hardest to come up with explanations. And if we try really hard and like repeatedly all the explanations aren't working, and then at some point we might say, well, maybe it's a brute fact. But I don't know that we'd ever reach the point of saying we know it's a brute fact. So we want to minimize. So another way to put the principle is that the fewer brute facts you have, the better. Do not, to turn Occam's, remember Occam's razor, which says, do not multiply entities unnecessarily, all other things being equal, the simplest theory is best. Well, there's sort of a reverse principle, I think, which would say that one should not multiply brute facts unnecessarily, which is a consequence of the idea that we should try to explain as much as we can and be really persistent, though conceding that there might be some brute facts. Though one could never conclusively prove that something was a brute fact. But at some point, you might begin to speculate that after generations of trying to find an explanation and coming up empty-handed, you might begin to suspect that you may be dealing with a brute fact. Maybe even in some case you could prove that something's a brute fact. Maybe. Like the universe itself. Maybe there could be an argument that there couldn't be an explanation of the entire universe because any attempt to explain it would involve something in the universe which would make it a circle. But there wouldn't be too many brute facts, all right? And you want to try to minimize them. And we certainly have no reason then to think that Morris, Felix, and Garfield being cats is a brute fact. Seems like there's some significant reason why the three of them go in the same group, whereas the shoe, the sneaker, and the water bottle and the book don't fall into that group with them. Nor do they even seem to fall into any group with each other, right? Of the same, of that level of generality. They seem to be just different kinds of things, right? Sneakers, books, and water bottles. I guess they fall into some common group, like physical object, right? But that's at a higher level of generality than something like catness, or cat, the cat group would be. Right. There doesn't seem to be any common grouping at that level that would cover the book, the shoe, and the water bottle. Right. Though maybe at some higher level, there might be all sorts of common things. They're all physical objects. They're all artifacts. They're all this, but they're not all. But basically, the three different kinds of things: books, shoes, and containers. Right. Okay, so there's got to be something about Morris, Felix, and Garfield which accounts for all of them being cats. That seems pretty plausible. Some nominalist might try to deny it if he could show that all attempts to explain this are doomed to failure. But we haven't gotten there yet, right? So premise 2 could be revisited, I suppose, if we find some really strong arguments or conclusive proofs that there couldn't be an explanation of this. Okay, premise 3 then says this something, the something which explains why Morris, Felix, and Garfield are all cats, can only be their catness, that they share a common quality of felininity or catness. So the idea is that Morris exemplifies the quality of catness, Felix exemplifies that quality, Garfield exemplifies that quality, and so on and so forth for other examples of cats. Each of them having that quality entails in each case that each of them is a cat, and therefore explains why all of them are cats. Therefore, catness exists. Catness is posited by this argument as the best explanation of why all of them are cats. So that's the strategy here. So this is this formal cause argument is an argument from dealing with metaphysical explanation. It's saying that there must be an abstract entity of catness over and above the concrete individual cats in order to explain why the concrete individual cats fall into the same group. And that explanation can only be, or is best understood, as a shared quality of those cats, the possession of which entails that each is a cat. Okay, everyone following the reasoning here? So would this argument be logically valid? That is, if the premises are true, would it necessarily follow that the conclusion is true? Clearly, it is logically valid. If all three premises are true, catness indeed exists. So the only question remaining is the argument sound. That is, are the three premises taken individually true? And what kinds of supporting evidence can be given in favor of the truth of each premise? Or, on the other hand, can evidence be given against one or more of these premises to undermine the soundness of the argument? So if you have a valid argument, one where if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true, but you can show that some of the premises probably aren't true or are of highly questionable truth, then the argument may not be sound. And if it's not sound, even though it's an example of valid reasoning, it still doesn't establish the conclusion to any reasonable degree of probability, unless the premises are strongly supported. But if the premises are highly plausible and the argument is logically valid, then you have a strong case for the conclusion that catness exists in this case. The argument wouldn't say, though, whether catness as a quality is something that depends on the cats existing or not. So it would be neutral as between Platonic and Aristotelian, or extreme and moderate realism. Putting it another way, the argument would establish at most moderate realism, but it would be consistent with extreme realism. But it wouldn't prove extreme realism. It doesn't say that catness would exist even if Morris, Felix, and Garfield didn't. It says it would exist, though, if they do exist. Okay, so we're not going to question premise one for the time being, right? That Morris, Garfield, and Felix are cats. And we're going to bracket any challenges to premise two, right? Until we look at some possible explanations. So that takes us to three, right? What are the explanations? We've looked at the realist explanation already, right? That they share a quality of catness, which would surely explain why all three of them are cats. If they each have catness, because having catness definitely makes you a cat. So the question is, well, there are two questions. One is there something defective or questionable or dubious about answering the question in the way that number three answers it? Is there some objection to saying that they have catness? Okay, so that's one line a nominalist might take in criticizing or critiquing the formal cause argument. The other possibility would be for the nominalist to come up with some alternative explanation. And it would have to be an explanation that does not involve positing any abstract, universal, or shareable quality like catness. So let's look at that possibility first. Is there some alternative explanation that doesn't presuppose the existence of a shareable, universal quality like catness? can we explain it some other way? Okay, one possibility, if we're going to try to explain this and not just wave our hands and say this is just a brute fact, right? Just a brute fact that we have some cats here. That's that. Can't be explained. Right? One possibility is what I would call the verbal definition theory. So let's have a look at that nominalistic attempt to avoid postulating catness. So these are nominalistic theories of things falling into a common grouping, right? So verbal definition theory. So the verbal definition theory says, yes, we can explain why Morris, Felix, and Garfield are cats. Okay, we can explain this. We can do it linguistically by coming up with a verbal definition of what it is to be a cat. So what we're saying is there's a predicate or word cat, or a concept of cat or whatever, and we can give a definition of what that is. We can give necessary and sufficient conditions, which provide necessary and sufficient criteria for something's either being a cat or not being a cat, depending on whether they meet those criteria or not. And then we can say Morris meets the definition, and Felix meets the definition, and Garfield meets the definition, and so on. And provided that they all meet that definition, it will follow that they're all cats because they meet the verbal definition of the word cat. Okay. That wouldn't involve us in positing any kind of abstract quality, right? It would just be saying we can give a definition of what it is to be a cat in terms of other words. So we've explained why these things fall under the word cat, or why we can say that they're cats in terms of our being able to say that they satisfy other terms which define what it is to be a cat. Doesn't seem like in doing any of that we are necessarily committed to belief in catness. So how would we define a cat? Well, something, say, like being a four-legged, furry mammal that purrs, and likes milk and fish, has retractable claws, and so on. So we'd list all these. And then we'd say something is a cat if and only if it meets those criteria, and that's the definition of a cat, and each one of them satisfies that definition. So will that work? Do we have a definition of a cat? Well, a definition has to be not just materially adequate, but it has to be adequate to all possible cases. Like if you define a triangle, it has to apply not just to this triangle or that triangle, but to all possible triangles. So if we define a triangle as a plane figure, a closed plane figure with three straight sides, whatever, right? Say that would apply to all possible triangles. Or if we define a bachelor as a unmarried man, say, right, that for that to be a correct definition would have to be the case that necessarily something's a bachelor if and only if it's an unmarried man. If you could come up with a counterexample, right, then you'd have to change your definition. Right, like for example, a widower wouldn't be a bachelor, even though he was an unmarried man, right? Or a divorcee wouldn't be a bachelor, even though he is an unmarried man. So the definition wouldn't actually be correct. We'd have to add some more stuff, right? So we could amend the definition. Right? Say, an unmarried man never before married. And we might have to add other things, right? The hope would be that after we deal with the odd cases, right, we'd eventually come up with a definition which is necessary and sufficient. So is a definition of a cat as a four-legged furry animal that likes milk and fish and has retractable claws and so on. Is that going to be an absolutely correct definition of a cat? Or could there be possible cases where something either meets those conditions and isn't a cat, or where there's a cat that doesn't meet those conditions, showing either that the definition doesn't provide a sufficient condition for being a cat, or it fails to provide a necessary condition, or both. So are there cats that don't have four legs, for example? There might be, right? Couldn't there possibly be a cat that wasn't four-legged, or that wasn't furry? Maybe if it had to have chemotherapy or something because it had a cancer or something, it would lose its fur for a while. A furless cat. I think there is some hairless species of cat anyway, right? Like an Egyptian cat or something. And some cats only have 3 legs because they lost a leg in an accident, or they had a birth defect, and so on. Right? So it's not so easy to come up with a definition of cat that'll work. And that would be a problem for the verbal definition theory, right? If we can't define cat. So is anyone willing to put forward an absolute definition of cat? Do you think that would be easy to do? It doesn't seem like it'd be that easy, right? So until the nominalist actually provides the goods, he wouldn't have refuted the argument until he actually comes up with a verbal definition of what a cat is, right? He's going to have a problem. It seems really hard if you think about the possibility of genetic mutations to come up with any kind of definition that would work in all possible cases. I mean, even if you provide an analysis of the genome of cats, say, there still could be a mutation which would change that genome, and the question would arise, is that thing a cat or not, right? Or, are the, in the movie, the X-Men, where they have all the movie, the many, many movies of the X-Men, are they members of the human race, or are they a different species, right? Well, it's not clear, right? So it seems to throw the whole question into doubt as to how much mutational change a given species can tolerate before it becomes a different species. I mean, the general answer is when you have sexual reproduction, is as long as it can sexually reproduce with members of the two groups are interfertile, that they belong to the same species. So, as far as that goes. But that could allow for a lot of other changes, right? So long as they remained interfertile. And of course, that criterion only applies to sexually reproducing organisms. So if you take kinds that are like protozoa and stuff in bacteria, and the kinds they belong to, you don't have that criterion. Since they don't reproduce sexually, they just reproduce, say, by binary fission, right? This split, whatever. You don't have even that guideline. So it becomes really mysterious when you get a new species and when you don't. So it'd be very hard to come up with a definition of cat. So maybe, I'm not saying this is true, maybe cat is indefinable. But we can't say that for sure. And that gets into our question about brute facts, right? Because if cat is indefinable, then being a cat in terms of a verbal definition is a brute fact, whatever. But of course, the realist will say, no, we can still explain it by saying that a cat has catness. So it's not a brute fact. In general, in the empiricist tradition of epistemology and associated metaphysical views, empiricists have said, in general, that there are some indefinable terms. And that's been sort of the empiricist standpoint. And they've usually identified them with basic or fundamental qualities of sense data or qualia. So the basic qualities of perceptible things, like colors, like red, has been held to be, by empiricists, that's one argument. They say that you can't give a verbal definition of a word like red. Because the only way you can know what red is by immediately experiencing it through direct perceptual acquaintance with the quality. They claim that people who are born congenitally, who are born blind or are congenitally blind, would be unable to ever grasp the meaning of the term red, that it could never be explained to them through a verbal description or definition. That you can only learn it through what's called an ostensive definition. An ostensive definition is when you define something by pointing to it and somebody can see it. So you can say, well, by red we mean, right, the quality of that pencil case. Or by red we mean the color of this shirt. Or anything like that. Sufficiently like it. So if we take that point of view, then there are going to be some indefinable general terms. So if there are some indefinable general terms, for example, terms that apply to basic sensory qualities of experience, often referred to as qualia or sense data qualities, like red or the taste of a particular pickle, or the sound of middle C, or the odor of garlic, and so on and so forth. These types of qualities are held to be not verbally definable, but only definable through the ostensive definition of pointing to something which you then directly experience by yourself. So that's one argument, anyway, for saying that there have to be at least some indefinable general terms. So a general term is a term that can apply to many things. And if it can't be verbally defined, then it's indefinable. Maybe cat is an indefinable general term, as far as we've been able to tell, but I think that would be probably a pretty contentious argument. There's much wider acceptance for the idea that the qualities of basic sensory data are such indefinable general terms. So even if cat can be defined by some really long definition, listing all the possible genomes that cats could have, right, and still be cats, right? Even though we couldn't produce it, I guess it's conceivable that there is such a very long definition that covers all possible cats. And you might have to do some legislating and say, well, right, at a certain point. But that just might be due to our ignorance of what the cutoff is between different species or something like that. So the nominalist hasn't actually answered the case of the cat, but maybe in principle it's possible to come up with a workable definition. At the very least, it would be very, very long. I think if it's infinitely long, there's a problem for the nominalists. But if it's finitely long, but just incredibly long, nominalists probably would prevail, provided he could come up with a definition. But there are the other case of the simple qualities that seems not to have an explanation. Now, a nominalist might say, well, the simple it's a brute fact that, say, 3 things are red, or 3 things have the pickle taste, or 3 lines are straight, straightness being another one of these. Indefinable. Basic sensory qualities. They might say those are indefinable and therefore can't be explained, but given those basic qualities, we can define other qualities. So we could define what a cat is through some very long definition, if you'll grant us that there are some basic qualities that are undefined. But if one wants to have as few brute facts as possible, then there's still the motivation to try to go ahead and come up with an explanation of what makes 3 red things red, or what makes 3 pickles all have the pickle taste, and so on. So then we'd be back to the realist argument, that what makes them all the same is that they share a common quality. So it looks like the verbal definition theory runs into some pretty serious problems on the assumption that there are some indefinable general terms, whether they be simple properties of sense data, like red and purple and so on, or whether they be even more seemingly rich properties, like being a dog or a cat, which seem very hard to define as well. Incidentally, you might think you could define a term like red. You might think you could define it in terms of the wavelengths of light that red things reflect, or something of this sort. Right? So you might think that for each color, objects have a certain microstructure which causes them to reflect that wavelength of light, and that's why they have the color that we think they have. So that red things have a structure that reflect a certain wavelength of electromagnetic radiation. Depending on the color, it would be a different one. There's a problem with that, though. I mean, that seems the most obvious way to try to define, say, something like a color. The problem is, though, that although we can speak of color that way, we can also speak of the colors had by our sensations, these inner sensations that we have. Like if you rub your eyes, for example, you'll see all kinds of colors. Yet those colors aren't caused by any wavelengths and are not associated with those wavelengths. Because if your eyes are closed and no light's coming in, and you're rubbing your eyes and you're seeing purple donuts with these splash yellow centers coming out of them, that's caused by manual stimulation of your optic nerve, not by light striking on your optic nerve. That seems to disassociate color from wavelength, so that it becomes possible to have the color without the wavelength, which means that the wavelength can't be a necessary condition of having the color. Similarly, when you're dreaming, you may see colors, even though you're in a totally dark room, right? So it's the colors of the sensations, or sense data, as I've also referred to them as, or qualia, as they're sometimes called, that creates the problem of definition. Otherwise, if you try to define colors, it seems like you get into a process of circular definition. Like if you say, orange can be defined as a color which is intermediate between what? Yellow and red. You give that as your definition. But that then just pushes the problem off to yellow and red. And how do you define those? Well, you could do the same thing again, but then you're eventually going to get into a circle, right, of these definitions. Much like defining necessity in terms of possibility and possibility in terms of necessity. And that sort of thing. So you'll have a closed circle of very closely linked concepts that belong to the same family, and it seems like you'll have either circular definitions or you'll have to assume at least one color is undefined. Undefined verbally, that is. We do define the color it seems, just by pointing to samples and saying, that's what we mean by red or blue. And it seems like that's actually true to the fact of how we do it, right? I mean, you don't teach children color words by giving them definitions of the colors, like that red is the way that apples look or something like that. It seems more like we give them an apple and we say, that's red, right? And then they know that apples are red, whatever. So it looks like verbal definition theory is going to hit some serious obstacles. Then the next possibility is what I'll call the causal theory. The causal theory says that what makes Morris a cat is that Morris's parents were cats. So it's like a causal thing. I mean, why is Morris a cat? Because he came from cats. And like begets like. Right? So the children of a given creature, right, will be of the same species or kind as the parents. Like begets like. And the same thing would be true of Morris, right? He also had cat parents, right? His parents weren't horses or something, right? And Garfield also came from cat parents, right? So it seems like we can explain in each case why each one is a cat by their parentage, biological heritage, together with the principle that like begets like. So what would the realists say about that explanation? Will that work? Okay, so where did the first cat come from? It was asked. Yeah, that assumes that there is a first cat, which seems like a highly plausible assumption. We don't generally believe that cats regress infinitely. That would be the other option. If we say that cats go back infinitely, then we could keep on doing it by saying that each generation it's causally explained by a generation before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. So that would lead to an infinite regression of cats. Now, an infinite regression of cats seems pretty implausible and sort of unpalatable, right?
Species, there are some species that can breed together.
Such as?
What is it, adopting horse?
Oh, you mean sort of like hybrids?
Mm-hmm.
Giving rise to mules?
Mm-hmm.
Right, but there the child is not of the same kind as the parent. So here we're just trying to explain the cases where the offspring is of the same kind. I think what you say is correct. I don't think that would damage the anomalous argument yet. Right. I think more damaging is that we get this infinite regress of cats, which doesn't seem very reasonable. And why doesn't it seem reasonable? Because the two most plausible theories of cats both imply that there's not an infinite regress of cats. What are those two theories? One of them is the divine creation theory, which says, right, that cats were created by God along with other living creatures, right? That God created everything in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. You know how it goes, right? Divine creation story. So, if you believe in the divine creation account, from the Bible, then the first cat would not have come from a cat. No, he would have come from God, but God's not a cat. And so that would like throw off the whole model, right? According to this model, cats have to come from cats. That's what explains it. So if a cat came from God, that would mess up the model, right? So I guess thinking about your point about the mules, right? I guess if we ran the argument with mules, right? We said there were these three mules, Aloysius and right, Sam and Sally, these three mules, right? You could point out that they didn't come from mules, right? So we wouldn't have an explanation by the causal theory. So that would be a problem too. So I think now that I'm looking at it in that way, yeah, that would raise the problem that in the case of three mules, we couldn't explain why they're all mules by saying that they all came from mules. So that would screw that up as well. So good point. So the divine creation theory seems to require that God create the first cat, which doesn't fit in with the theory, unless we believe that God's a cat, which apparently the ancient Egyptians thought that they were cat gods, right? But that would seem to lead toward a more polytheistic account, where we'd have a different God for every different kind of thing. So like there was a dog god who created dogs and a cat god, right? And we'd have to have an infinite number of gods, which seems like highly unparsimonious, to say the least. Right? So, anyway, nobody today believes that God could possibly be a cat. So the divine creation model is not going to help with us. The only other model is the evolutionary model, which is what virtually all scientists believe, and which I myself think is highly well confirmed. Though it's not inconsistent with the existence of a God. God could have created evolution, right? If you're like a deist, like the founding fathers of the United States were, you could combine belief in God with evolution very easily, right? Just by saying that there is a God, he created the physical world and created it in such a way that creatures evolved by natural selection and evolutionary adaptation and so on. So that's not really an issue about whether God exists or not, but about what the most plausible account of the origin of the species is. So if we think that that's the evolutionary theory of Darwin or some more modern version of that, they call the neo-Darwinian hypothesis. It's basically a variation on Darwin's theories, which has been enhanced by genetic discoveries. Other things that we've learned since the 19th century about biology. Then you'd have to say that cats what? Evolved from some other kind of creature, right? So there were these like other mammals before cats, like maybe some kind of weasel-like or fox-like creatures, right? There were these like four-legged furry things with whiskers that weren't cats, but right? They weren't cats yet, but some of them branched off and became cats, and some became dogs, right? And some became foxes, and some became, right? Through evolution. Then again, you'd be violating the causal model, which says that cats, all being cats, have to be explained by having cat parents, because there would be some first cats that had non-cat parents, whatever prior mammal-type creatures that cats evolved from. So it doesn't look like the causal theory can work, right? So although a nominalist theory because it only uses concrete cats to explain other concrete cats. It doesn't seem to work. So that could bring us back to the shared quality theory, given that the nominalist theories are unsuccessful. Can you think of some other nominalist theory that we could use? Using only concrete things to explain why all three of them are cats. It doesn't bring in the idea of a shared quality of catness or being a cat. Seems difficult, right? Other than these two models. Well, at this point, sometimes anomalists come in and say, well, we can't come up with an explanation. However, there's something logically incoherent or fatally defective about the shared property theory, so that we're going to say a pox on everybody's house. These may be the only nominalist theories, and they don't work, but your realist theory doesn't work either, and so therefore no theory is going to work, and so we should go to the brute fact thing and just say, we just have to accept that, there are cats or there are red things or something, whatever, right? And that it can't be explained. It's just a brutal fact of the world that things come in these kinds. And maybe more complex kinds can be explained in terms of simpler kinds, but the simple ones, at any rate, don't have any explanation. That would take a little of the sting out of it, right? If you could explain, if you could define more complex kinds like cat and dog in terms of simpler, indefinable kinds like red and square, red and straight, and the taste of a pickle and those types of kinds. If you could pull all that off, which is far from a settled issue, that you could define cat even. But so they raise an objection to the realist account, and the objection takes the form also of an infinite regress objection. So it sort of goes like this. So we have the three cats here, and according to the realist theory, the reason that all three of them are cats is that they share a common quality of catness, right? So. Now they say once you've done this, once you admit that catness is an autonomous entity, a quality that exists apart from cats, and which explains why cats all fall in the common group of cats. Once you've taken that step, you've now introduced a new common factor among the three cats that also needs to be given an explanation, another explanation, a different explanation. And that new fact that you've now introduced is that Morris exemplifies catness, Felix exemplifies catness, and Garfield exemplifies catness. So at the first level, you were saying what we need to explain is why are they all cats? And the answer was, well, they all have catness. That's why they're all cats. But now the nominalist is urging that now we need to explain why all three of them share the commonality of having catness. And that's a different thing than being a cat. Because if it wasn't different, it wouldn't explain. why they were all cats, right? So having catness or exemplifying catness, speaking more technically, exemplifying catness must be a different property than being a cat because it explains, right? Or putting it another way, the kind cat must be a different kind than the kind exemplifies catness. So you have one kind, which is cats, and then you have another kind, things that exemplify catness, which will call out now for an explanation. And they can't be the same kind, because otherwise we would have had a circular explanation. And they don't seem to be the same kind. The first kind just talked about concrete things, cats. Second kind brings in exemplifying this abstract quality, which itself isn't a cat at all, but some kind of abstract entity, catness, some kind of ethereal, shareable essence of quality. So now the nominalist says, now that you've explained why they're all cats by their sharing catness, you've got to explain why they all exemplify catness. And the explanation would have to be that they all share exemplifying catness. That Morris has exemplifying catness, Felix has exemplifying catness, and Garfield has exemplifying catness. And exemplifying catness is a different property than catness. Because if they were the same property, then how would we have explained anything? Right? So they suggest that now we've got to explain why each of them exemplifies catness. And if we don't have to explain that, then why do we have to explain why the three of them were cats? Right? So it seems like if there was an impetus to explain why Morris, Felix, and Garfield are cats, there's the same impetus to explain why Morris, Felix, and Garfield each can be said to be such that they exemplify catness. And so we will now need a second property. In addition to catness, we now need to have the second property of exemplifying catness, which becomes a different property than catness. I would note that these two properties are equivalent to each other. That is, necessarily something has catness if and only if it has exemplifying catness. Right, so they're going to be equivalent properties. So one might think that's enough to make them the same property, and we don't really have a regress. But it's not generally true that properties that are equivalent are identical. Remember the example of having a heart and having a kidney, being a chordate and being a renate. Different properties, even if necessarily all chordates are renates and all renates are chordates, and you can think of many other examples as well. Being a trilateral seems to be a different property than being a triangle. One is the property of being a three-angled closed figure, and the other the property of being a three-sided closed figure. The two are equivalent, but they seem to be different qualities because one of them is a quality involving how many angles a thing has, and the other is a property involving how many sides a thing has. And sides and angles seem to be different things, and so they seem to be different properties. And many mathematical properties that are quite different can be equivalent, like the property of being such that 7 and 5 is 12, and the property of being such that 1 and 1 is 2 are equivalent in the very same sense, that necessarily something has the one property if and only if it has the other, but they seem to be very different qualities. One saying that 7 and 5 is 12, and the other that 2 and 2 is 4, which seem to be totally different subject matters, even though they're equivalent. So it looks like now we have two properties, catness and exemplifying catness. And then we have to explain why each of them has that property in common. So we'll need a third property, which is exemplifying Katniss. And now we're off to the races. We'll have an infinite number of these abstract properties. So it's starting to look like the infinite regress of cats, remember argument? And now we have an infinite regress of these exemplifying Katniss properties. So we'll have Katniss at level 1, and then exemplifying Katniss at level 2, and then there'll be the property of exemplifying Katniss at level 3. And at level 4, the property of exemplifying Katniss. So on ad infinitum. So this is the main argument that nominalists have given against the Katniss theory, that it leads to an infinite regress of explanations. So what do you think? Is this regress as bad as the infinite regress of cats? Doesn't seem as bad. We know that we seem to have extraordinarily good evidence that cats are not eternal to the universe, that they didn't always exist, so that the infinite regress of cats couldn't possibly be feasible. That doesn't seem to be true here. Here we're dealing just with these abstract entities. And we know that abstract entities in general must be infinite, like numbers. And sets. So just prima facie, on the face of it, it doesn't look like this infinite regress is as bad as the other. And if our imperative is to have as few brute facts as possible and explain as much as we can, then why wouldn't we just keep on going explaining these things? So it's not clear that every infinite regress in explanation is bad. Maybe it's only the causal ones that involve efficient causes or motions that are objectionable. Or maybe even those are okay. I mean, why in general must an infinite series of explanations be bad? I mean, couldn't it turn out, for example, that in doing empirical science, we keep on discovering that every particle that we discover is capable of further division into smaller particles? I mean, so far that hasn't been what science has found. Our current model, called the Standard Model, posits some fundamental particles, like electrons, that can't be further divided. But we've seen many times in the history of science that views have changed and theories get revised, and it's possible, or at least conceivable, that we'll find out that these particles aren't truly fundamental and they are made of even smaller particles. And that seems like that process could, in theory, go on forever, couldn't it? In which case you'd have an infinite level of explanations that would just go on and on and on. And why would that be bad? Clear why that would be bad. It would just mean that we'd have our work cut out for us and that we'd be explaining things forever. It would never reach the ultimate explanation. More work for scientists to do. They've got guaranteed lifetime occupation. But it seems like the more levels you have, isn't it better? Because haven't you explained something more comprehensively and deeply, the more explanations you can give of it, even if they never bottom out to an ultimate explanation? Anyway, that's the case that could be made. I'm not saying that I've established that. I guess there's also an intuition that you want your explanations to end somewhere in some ultimate starting point. But it seems to me like at worst these two sort of balance, and we sort of have to shrug our shoulders and say, well, we're not sure whether explanations have to come to an end at some point or whether they can go on. So I would say that the case against the realist isn't proven by this, just because abstract entities by their nature seem to proliferate to infinity anyway. I mean, one might well map this infinite regress onto the infinite regress or the infinite progress of the natural numbers, right? So you can, it's just the fact that there are so many abstract entities that allows us to model mathematics on set theory. And sets go on in the same kind of way. You start out with one thing, like the empty set, and you have the set of that, and the set of that, and the set of that. And from nothing you get an infinite number of sets. So if that's okay, why not an infinite series of properties, especially if it explains something. This is actually an explanatory regress. So I guess that would be a big issue in metaphysics, whether you can have infinite explanatory regressions or not. But I think it's still an open book on that question. The case is not closed one way or the other on that. Some have this intuitive gut feeling that it's got to come to a stop somewhere. Like if you think of a domino cascade, you know what that is, where you set up the dominoes, right? So if you were to come on the scene and see a domino cascade in progress, you would of course assume that there must have been a first domino to tumble to start off the cascade, and that therefore the explanations must come to an end in some ultimate domino that fell, right? You might think that. But remember, dominoes are artificially created objects. So of course, if you were talking about dominoes, there would have had to have been a first domino in the cascade, because dominoes are man-made things, and they couldn't have always existed and always been engaged in this tumble. But instead of dominoes, suppose you were thinking of some kind of natural objects that were in some sequence of, say, particles that are colliding, right? Like a first particle hitting a second, hitting a third, hitting a fourth. These particles just naturally exist. Then I think there'd be much more doubt about whether there had to be a first particle necessarily to start it off. And one could imagine that the particles have always been engaged in this process of collision. It seems like it would be possible, since the particles might just necessarily exist or something, right? That as far back as you go, there were particles engaged in the sequential process, and it never started off with any initial particle being impelled. Each one was impelled by an earlier one ad infinitum back into the past. Really, this is what has motivated a lot of people. This dispute has motivated a lot of people as far as, sort of the cosmological type of arguments to say that God must exist. There must be a first cause. Others say there doesn't have to be a first cause. It could just go back and back and back and back without any initial cause to start the process off. So that remains kind of an open question. I have some doubts about whether this infinite regress argument with the Katnisses and exemplifying Katniss, exemplifying that is really really. I have my doubts about the strength of this argument as a refutation of the realist model, but you can judge for yourself whether you think that objection is conclusive or not. The nominalist, though, still has one more major move he can make. There's still one more theory that he could give of why Morris, Felix, and Garfield are all cats. It's true that it's a departure from the strictest, sometimes called the most austere or simplest or economical forms or sparsest forms of nominalism, but it's still consistent with a basic nominalist picture, at least interpreting nominalism as the belief that there are only particulars or even concrete particulars in the world. According to this model, we have to really enrich nominalism quite a bit and introduce some. We have to admit that there are qualities, but the qualities can themselves be particulars or concrete things, and then we can explain it. And this is known as trope theory or resemblance nominalism. I'll give it another title. We don't have much time left, so I'll give you the thing in a nutshell. We can talk more about it next time. But it basically says that each cat has its own particular, unique, concrete, spatially located catness. So there's the catness of Morris, which is a different particular spatiotemporal object than the catness of Felix. So each of the three cats and any other cats has its own unique, particular, concrete catness. So those would not be universals. They're not shareable or transferable. So Morris has got his catness, Felix, his catness, Garfield, his catness. And each of those catnesses are similar to one another. They form a circle of resemblance so that Morris's catness resembles Felix's, which resembles Garfield's, which resembles Morris's. So there's a circle of internal circle of similarity or resemblance among these particulars. Okay, and what explains why Morris, Felix, and Garfield are all cats is simply this, that each of them has his own or her own particular concrete catness, and those catnesses resemble each other. And that explains why all three of them are cats. Notice this is to introduce entities which are not corporeal. So it does depart from a kind of nominalism which is materialistic and only admits the existence of substantial bodies. It's saying we do need qualities, but if we make the qualities concrete entities, then we can still be nominalists because we don't believe in any universals. And we have this explanation of why all three of them are cats. This explanation, I think, is going to lead to the same kind of infinite regress that the abstract quality theory did. But if we accept it there, we should accept it here. If we reject it in both cases, we're going to be led to the brute fact theory. Well, I shouldn't say theory. Brute fact is not a theory. Brute fact response or reply. The denial that there can be an explanatory theory. So on that note, we'll call it quits for today. I'll have some more to say about the trope theory, which says that there's a particular quality for each of the cats which resemble each other. So I look forward to seeing you again on Thursday.